East Tupelo, Mississippi. It was January 8th, 1935. 4:15 a.m. In a two-room shotgun house on Old Saltillo Road, Gladys Presley lay exhausted after giving birth to her first child, a son they would name Jesse Garon. But the joy she expected to feel was replaced by a devastating silence. The baby boy was stillborn, his tiny body perfect but lifeless in the midwife's hands. 35 minutes later, as the midwife prepared to deliver the tragic news to Vernon Presley, Gladys felt the unmistakable pains of another contraction. In an era before ultrasound technology, no one had known she was carrying twins. The second baby, Elvis Aaron Presley, entered the world alive, healthy, and crying, unaware that he had lost his closest companion before he had even taken his first breath. That winter morning, in Depression-era Mississippi, two lives began and one ended, creating a wound in the surviving twin that would never heal. Elvis Aaron Presley would grow up carrying the weight of being the one who lived, believing he had somehow stolen his brother's life force, and spending his entire existence trying to fill a void that could never be filled. This is the documented story of Jesse Garon Presley, the twin who died but never left Elvis's side, and how the tragedy of that January morning shaped every aspect of Elvis's life, from his deepest fears to his spiritual beliefs to the devastating loneliness that no amount of fame or success could ever overcome. The circumstances surrounding the birth of the Presley twins were emblematic of the poverty and hardship that defined rural Mississippi during the Great Depression. Vernon and Gladys Presley couldn't afford a hospital birth, so Gladys delivered at home with the assistance of a local midwife. As was common for poor families in the region, the lack of prenatal care meant that the twin pregnancy went undetected until the moment of birth. Twin births were more dangerous in that era, particularly for families without access to modern medical care. The fact that one twin was stillborn while the other survived was not uncommon, but that statistical reality provided no comfort to parents grieving the loss of their child. Jesse Garon was buried the next day in an unmarked grave in Priceville Cemetery, a small plot of land that served the poor families of East Tupelo. Vernon Presley, barely 18 years old and struggling to support his young family, couldn't afford a headstone or proper marker for his son's grave. The funeral was a simple affair, attended only by immediate family and a few neighbors. According to family accounts, Gladys was too grief-stricken and physically weak to attend her son's burial, leaving Vernon to say goodbye to Jesse Garon alone. But while Jesse Garon was buried in that unmarked grave, he was never buried in the consciousness of his surviving twin. From his earliest moments, Elvis seemed aware of an absence that he couldn't understand or articulate, a sense that something essential was missing from his life. Gladys Presley's response to losing Jesse Garon profoundly shaped her relationship with Elvis throughout their lives. Having lost one son, she became fiercely protective of the survivor, creating a bond between mother and son that was unusually intense, even by the standards of Southern families. Gladys treated Elvis like he was the most precious thing in the world, because to her, he was, recalled family friend Lillian Mann in a 1989 interview. She had lost one baby, and she was determined that nothing would happen to the other one. That created a special closeness between them that lasted until the day she died. This protective intensity manifested in Gladys rarely allowing Elvis out of her sight during his early childhood. She walked him to school, picked him up afterward, and worried constantly about his safety and well-being. The fear of losing her surviving son created an atmosphere of anxiety and hypervigilance that Elvis absorbed from his earliest years. But perhaps more significantly, Gladys shared with Elvis the story of his twin brother from the time he was old enough to understand. Rather than keeping Jesse Garon's existence a secret, Gladys made sure Elvis knew that he had been born with a companion who had died, creating in the young boy an awareness of loss and absence that would haunt him throughout his life. "Mama always told me I had a brother who went to heaven," Elvis would later tell friends. She said Jesse was watching over me, but I always felt like I should have been watching over him instead. This early knowledge of his twin brother's death created in Elvis a profound sense of survivor's guilt that manifested in various ways throughout his childhood and adolescence. He often spoke of feeling incomplete, as if half of himself was missing, and displayed behaviors that suggested he was trying to live for two people rather than one. Elvis's early musical development was deeply influenced by his awareness of Jesse Garon's absence. According to family accounts, Elvis would often sing alone in his room, but he would address his songs to someone who wasn't there, as if he was performing for an invisible audience of one. Elvis would sit by himself and sing these sad songs, like he was trying to reach somebody. Remembered cousin Harold Lloyd, who visited the Presley home regularly during Elvis's childhood. When we asked him who he was singing to, he'd say he was singing to Jesse. Even as a little boy, he believed his brother could hear him. This belief that Jesse Garon could hear him through music became a central component of Elvis's spiritual and artistic development. Music wasn't just entertainment or self-expression for Elvis. It was a form of communication with the brother he had never known, but whose absence defined his existence. The gospel music that played such an important role in Elvis's early musical education took on additional significance because of his connection to Jesse Garon. The themes of death, resurrection, and reunion with loved ones in heaven that characterized gospel songs resonated with Elvis's longing to be reunited with his twin brother. Elvis understood gospel music in a way that was almost supernatural, observed Reverend Frank Smith, who knew the Presley family during Elvis's childhood. He didn't just sing those songs, he lived them, felt them in his bones. I always thought it was because he was singing to someone on the other side. The impact of Jesse Garon's death on Elvis became more apparent as he entered adolescence and began to grapple with questions of identity, purpose. The awareness that he was surviving in place of his brother created a sense of responsibility that was both inspiring and crushing. Elvis began to exhibit behaviors that suggested he felt obligated to live an exceptional life to justify his survival. His intense ambition, his drive to succeed, and his later generosity toward others all reflected a belief that he needed to make his life meaningful enough to honor the brother who had never had the chance to live. Elvis always acted like he had to be special, like he had to achieve something important, recalled high school friend George Klein. He'd say things like, "Jesse would have wanted me to make something of myself," or "I have to be successful for both of us." It was like he was carrying the dreams and potential of two people instead of one. This pressure to live for two people may have contributed to Elvis's later struggles with fame and success. The burden of representing not just himself but also the brother who never lived created expectations that no human being could possibly fulfill. The relationship between Elvis and the memory of Jesse Garon evolved as Elvis's own. Spiritual beliefs developed throughout his life. While raised in the Baptist tradition, Elvis became increasingly interested in various forms of spirituality and metaphysics, partly driven by his desire to understand his connection to his deceased twin. During his teenage years, Elvis began visiting Jesse Garon's grave regularly, often alone and usually at dawn or dusk when the cemetery was empty. These visits became a form of meditation and prayer for Elvis, moments when he could speak directly to the brother he had never met but whose presence he felt constantly. Elvis would go to that cemetery and just sit by Jesse's grave for hours, recalled Red West, who sometimes accompanied Elvis on these visits. He'd talk to Jesse like he was right there, telling him about what was happening in his life, asking for guidance. It wasn't crazy, it was just Elvis's way of staying connected to his brother. The conversations Elvis had at Jesse Garon's grave provided him with a form of spiritual comfort and guidance that he couldn't find elsewhere. In a world where he often felt misunderstood and isolated, his connection to Jesse represented a relationship that was pure, uncomplicated by the demands of fame or the expectations of others. As Elvis's career began to take off in the mid-1950s, his relationship with Jesse Garon's memory became more complex and emotionally charged. Success brought Elvis everything he had dreamed of, but it also intensified his feelings of guilt about being the twin who survived. Elvis would get depressed sometimes and say things like, "Jesse should be here, enjoying this with me," or "maybe Jesse was supposed to be the famous one," remembered Scotty Moore, Elvis's guitarist during the early years. Success made Elvis happy, but it also made him feel guilty, like he was taking something that should have belonged to his brother too. The guilt was compounded by Elvis's growing awareness of how much his success meant to his parents, particularly to Gladys, who had invested all her hopes and dreams in her surviving son. Elvis understood that his achievements were healing some of the pain Gladys felt about losing Jesse, but he also felt the weight of having to be successful enough to compensate for the loss of both sons. This pressure contributed to Elvis's perfectionism and his obsessive work ethic during his early career. He wasn't just performing for audiences or recording for commercial success. He was trying to create something meaningful enough to justify his survival and honor his brother's memory. The spiritual dimensions of Elvis's relationship with Jesse Garon became more pronounced during his Las Vegas period, when he had access to more resources and freedom to explore various forms of metaphysical belief and practice. In the early 1970s, Elvis began consulting with psychics and spiritual advisors, partly out of curiosity about various forms of spirituality, but also driven by his lifelong desire to communicate with Jesse Garon. These sessions, conducted in private and never publicized during Elvis's lifetime, represented his attempt to establish direct contact with his twin brother, Larry Geller, who served as Elvis's hairdresser and spiritual advisor during this period, witnessed Elvis's ongoing struggle to understand his connection to Jesse Garon. Elvis was always searching for answers about his brother, Geller recalled in his memoir. He wanted to know if Jesse was at peace, if they would be reunited after death, if Jesse was proud of what Elvis had accomplished. The psychic consultations provided Elvis with some comfort, as several spiritual advisors claimed to sense Jesse Garon's presence and to receive messages from him, whether or not these communications were genuine. They gave Elvis a sense that his brother was aware of his life and proud of his achievements. But the sessions also intensified Elvis's awareness of his own mortality and his anticipation of being reunited with Jesse after death. This anticipation may have contributed to Elvis's increasingly reckless behavior regarding his health and well-being during his final years. The prescription drug dependency that characterized Elvis's final decade was complicated by his spiritual beliefs about death and reunion with loved ones. While the drugs were initially prescribed for legitimate medical conditions, Elvis's attitude toward them was influenced by his belief that death would bring reunion with Jesse Garon and his mother Gladys. Elvis wasn't trying to die, but he wasn't afraid of dying either, observed Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal physician. He talked about death like it was going home, like it was where he belonged. He'd mentioned Jesse and his mother being on the other side, waiting for him. This lack of fear regarding death, combined with his increasing dependence on prescription medications, created a dangerous situation where Elvis was willing to take risks with his health that he might not have taken if he had been more invested in long-term survival. The spiritual comfort that Elvis derived from his anticipated reunion with Jesse may have actually contributed to his declining physical condition by reducing his motivation to take better care of himself. The impact of Jesse Garon's death on Elvis's relationships throughout his life was profound and often destructive. The void left by his twin brother's death created in Elvis an insatiable need for connection and companionship that no human relationship could entirely fulfill. Elvis's marriage to Priscilla Presley was complicated by his inability to be emotionally complete with any living person. The part of himself that belonged to Jesse Garon was never available to Priscilla or to anyone else, creating a barrier to intimacy that Priscilla struggled to understand and overcome. Elvis always seemed like he was holding something back. Priscilla reflected in her memoir. There was a part of him that felt unreachable, like he was saving something for someone else. I didn't understand it then, but now I realize he was probably saving part of himself for Jesse. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's entourage of male friends and employees, represented his attempt to create the brotherhood and companionship that he had lost when Jesse died. But these relationships, while meaningful, were also inherently unequal due to Elvis's fame and wealth, preventing them from providing the kind of unconditional connection that Elvis craved. Elvis's pattern of surrounding himself with people while still feeling lonely reflected his awareness that no living relationship could replace what he had lost before he was even aware he had lost it. The generosity that became legendary during Elvis's career was partly motivated by his guilt about surviving when Jesse had not. Elvis's compulsive gift-giving, his financial support for family and friends, and his charitable activities all reflected his belief that he needed to justify his survival by making life better for others. Elvis gave away so much because he felt guilty about having so much when Jesse had nothing, observed Charlie Hodge, who was close to Elvis for most of his career. It was like he was trying to share his good fortune with Jesse by sharing it with everyone else. This compulsive generosity created financial problems for Elvis throughout his career, as he was unable to refuse requests for help or to limit his gift-giving to reasonable amounts. But the financial cost was less important to Elvis than the emotional relief he gained from feeling that he was honoring Jesse's memory through his actions. The generosity also reflected Elvis's belief that his talents, success were not entirely his own, but belonged partly to the brother who had never had the chance to develop his own gifts and achieve his own success. Elvis's later career choices were influenced by his relationship with Jesse Garon's memory in ways that may have limited his artistic development. His reluctance to take creative risks or to explore more challenging material was partly motivated by his belief that he needed to maintain his success to honor Jesse's memory. Elvis was afraid of failing because he felt like he'd be failing for both of them, observed songwriter Mac Davis, who worked with Elvis during the 1960s and 1970s. He'd gotten so successful that he felt like he had to stay successful, like Jesse was counting on him to keep achieving great things. This pressure to maintain success may have prevented Elvis from pursuing the kind of artistic growth and experimentation that could have extended and deepened his career. Instead of taking risks that might have led to artistic breakthroughs, Elvis often chose safe, commercially proven approaches that guaranteed continued success but limited his creative development. The artistic stagnation that characterized much of Elvis's later career reflected not just the commercial pressures of the P.S. music industry, but also the emotional burden of feeling responsible for justifying two lives rather than just his own. The final years of Elvis's life were marked by increasing references to Jesse Garon and expressions of longing for reunion with his twin brother. As Elvis's health declined and his personal problems mounted, he spoke more frequently about death as a release from the burden of surviving without his other half. In the last few years, Elvis talked about Jesse more than ever, recalled Linda Thompson, who was Elvis's companion during much of the 1970s. He'd say things like, "Jesse's waiting for me," or "I'll see Jesse soon." It wasn't morbid. It was like he was talking about going home after a long trip. These expressions of longing for reunion with Jesse were accompanied by increasing spiritual exploration and preparation for death. Elvis spent considerable time reading about various religious and metaphysical beliefs about the afterlife, apparently seeking reassurance about what would happen when he died. The anticipation of reunion with Jesse may have provided Elvis with some comfort during his final difficult years, but it also represented a form of resignation about his earthly life that may have contributed to his declining interest in taking care of his health and well-being. Elvis Aaron Presley died on August 16, 1977, at Graceland, alone in his bathroom during the early afternoon. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, but the underlying causes were more complex, involving prescription drug toxicity, poor health habits, and the cumulative effects of decades of physical and emotional stress. In his final moments, Elvis was finally free from the burden of surviving without his twin brother, free from the guilt of being the one who lived, and free from the responsibility of living for two people instead of one. Jesse Garon Presley was buried in an unmarked grave in 1935, but when Elvis died 42 years later, he was interred at Graceland in a location that family members described as being prepared for both brothers. While Jesse's remains were never moved, Elvis's burial site included space and plans for his twin brother, representing Elvis's lifelong belief that they would eventually be reunited. The story of Elvis and Jesse Garon represents one of the most profound examples of how early trauma can shape an entire life. Even when that trauma occurs before conscious memory begins, Elvis carried the weight of his brother's death throughout his entire existence. And while that burden motivated some of his greatest achievements, it also prevented him from ever feeling complete or satisfied with his earthly life. The twin who died at birth had as much influence on Elvis Presley's life and career as any living person ever did. Jesse Garon Presley never spoke a word, never sang a song, never took a breath, but his absence shaped the voice, the music, and the legend of the King of Rock and Roll in ways that no amount of fame or success could ever overcome. In the end, Elvis's greatest performance may have been simply surviving for 42 years without the other half of himself, carrying the dreams and potential of two people while struggling with the loneliness and incompleteness that no human relationship could ever heal. The boy, who was born 35 minutes after his twin brother died, spent his entire life trying to fill a void that could only be filled by death itself. When Elvis finally died, the King of Rock and Roll was finally able to go home to the brother he had been missing since before he took his first breath.